The point here is, again, to do something that can be done with precision, to do something that does not involve inspiration but competence, in other words, to emulate the sciences. Now I have said that the other factor, the factor of organization, has also helped to produce the crisis in philosophy, and this, I think, is, if anything, even less obvious than my first point, that science poses a deep and critical problem for philosophy. After all, happily, we don't have organization in philosophy the way we do have it in religion. There's nothing at all unusual for a philosopher going it alone. Of course, there are some little clubs where people get together who happen to agree particularly with each other, but that is the exception rather than the rule. And the whole philosophy is lucky in not being beset by hierarchies and organizations and all that sort of thing. But in another sense, philosophy has become organized. Let's put the point this way. What I've been saying about philosophy, relinquishing problems of religious and political and cosmic and moral variety so very largely, and becoming so very preoccupied with questions of method, of science, of logic, amounts to saying that philosophy has become, in the 20th century, exceedingly academic. And if we ask why philosophy has become so terribly academic, surely a very important part of the answer is that philosophy has become academic because almost all philosophers are in academies. The organizations in question are our colleges and universities. We take it for granted that, of course, if a man says, and is in his right mind, that he is a philosopher, that presumably he means that he teaches philosophy at some college or university. But if we think back a few centuries, that of course did not used to be so. People like Descartes and Locke and Hobbes and Berkeley and Hume and Spinoza, they were not professors. They did not have university jobs, and this surely makes a big difference. It does not make all of the difference by itself. We can be more precise here. We can almost be scientific. We can quantify the point. And we can say that the really crucial point about organization is that where formerly, at any one time, in any one generation, there were maybe half a dozen or at most a dozen philosophers, today there are quite literally many thousands. That's no exaggeration. All you have to do is to take some such dictionary as Webster's Collegiate, look up in the back the list of colleges. I think you will find that in the United States alone there are over 1,000 colleges and universities, and most of them have more than one philosopher. Some of them have over a dozen philosophers, which means that in the United States alone you have thousands of philosophers. But this is an entirely new situation which is bound to change the whole tone of philosophy. The unit of publication, for example, can no longer be the book. Nobody has time to read books by thousands and thousands of philosophers. Something new has to be invented to take care of this situation, the scholarly journal. I'm not trying to make fun of this. Perhaps in some way the situation is amusing, but we have here a perfectly reasonable development. There are these thousands of people. They live spread out over a huge country. They can't constantly get together and see each other face to face and talk with each other. How are they going to make each other aware that they are alive physically, that they are alive intellectually, that they have something to say? They have to be scholarly, professional journals in which people write articles of which other people can take note. And these articles, for the most part, are written for what has been called, rightly, fellow craftsmen, fellow technicians, other people who are professionals in the field. Well, if a man like Spinoza had written just for fellow philosophers, there wouldn't have been any need to print his books. He could have circulated them in manuscript, and within 2 years, all the fellow philosophers around could easily have read them. This wasn't so just in Spinoza's time, but this was so for a long, long time while philosophy flourished. But these philosophers did not just address this minute audience of maybe 6 or 12 other philosophers, that was all there was in those days, but they addressed the layman too, and so they didn't deal just with academic points, but they dealt with questions that mattered to people generally. While today, most professional philosophers lean over backwards not to do that. Take a young man in his 20s who in the 18th century wrote a book with the title Treatise of Human Nature, being an attempt to introduce the experimental method of reasoning into moral subjects. His name was David Hume, and the book that he wrote was a great book, which is still studied. But what young professional philosopher in his 20s would dare write a book with a title like that and try to cover so many subjects in a single book? It so happened that Hume's book was initially not a success, but fell stillborn from the presses, as he himself put it. But in time, it had an enormous impact. Here then we have the contrast. And we actually find some of the professional philosophers, Warnock, for example, in his little book on English philosophy since 1900, making fun, without naming names, of the amateurs of former ages and extolling the professional philosophers of our time. I feel that the shoe is a little bit on the other foot, and that amateurs like, for example, Hume and Berkeley, who published their major works when they were still in their 20s, are not people for us to look down on. And I dare say that the reason why young philosophers today don't write books like that is not because those books were so amateurish and so bad, but rather because they were so extremely bold. Now, this is a good point, I think, to introduce the philosopher of the evening, and I will do it with a quotation that relates in immediately to what I have characterized as the crisis in philosophy. Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, section 212, which is reprinted or translated in full in the Portable Nietzsche, that traditionally the great philosopher has always stood in opposition to his today. I'm abbreviating the section. The great philosopher traditionally has stood in opposition to his today. Philosophers have been the bad conscience of their time. They knew of a new greatness of man, of a new untrodden way to his enhancement. Confronted with a world of modern ideas, which would banish everybody into a corner and a specialty, a philosopher, if there could be any philosophers today, would be forced to define the greatness of man, the concept of greatness, in terms precisely of man's comprehensiveness and multiplicity, his wholeness and manifoldness. Then Nietzsche gives some illustrations of 16th century philosophers, goes on to talk a little bit about Socrates, and continues, today, conversely, when only the herd animal is honored and dispenses honors in Europe, and when equality of rights could all too easily be converted into an equality in violating rights, by that I mean into a common war on all that is rare, strange, or privileged, on the higher man, the higher soul, the higher duty, the higher responsibility, and on the wealth of creative power and mastery, today the concept of greatness entails being noble, wanting to be by oneself, being capable of being different, standing alone and having to live independently. Thus, in 1886, Ludwig Wittgenstein would not only have understood, but I think would have agreed very largely. He too, by temperament, was a man who was different, stood alone, lived independently. But on the whole, certainly ordinary language philosophy, linguistic philosophy, analytic philosophy, whatever we shall call it, is not very much in sympathy with the sentiments expressed by Nietzsche here, but on the contrary, an example of what you might call counter-revolutionary philosophy, not really a revolution in philosophy. Traditionally, the philosopher has been a revolutionary, a heretic, who stood in opposition to us today. But linguistic philosophy has an influence that leads men away from trying to stand alone. It would indeed, as Nietzsche puts it, banish philosophers into a corner and a specialty. It teaches young philosophers not to become heretics, not to become revolutionaries, because it wouldn't be scientific, and they really don't have any special competence that qualifies them for that role. Nietzsche might well have said that it might be a philosopher's business, if there could be any philosophers today, to acquire such a competence. And if you should say, well, it would be terrible if we trained all our young philosophers to become revolutionaries of this sort, this would just bring intellectual chaos, the answer would be that if you decide that nobody should even try things that not everybody can do, surely that would amount to what Nietzsche calls a common war on all that is rare, strange, or privileged, on the higher man, the higher soul, the higher duty, the higher responsibility.